Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and we are going to conclude our Concept 1 discussion in Part 3 today, where we're going to be looking at bone cells that make up our bone tissue. There's 3 types we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the process of bone generation, so how we make new bone. We're going to talk about how bone is remodeled, what that process is like, and we're going to talk about what happens whenever we might unfortunately experience a bone fracture and a bone breaks. How does your body go about healing those fractures? So let's get right into it. All right, so there are 3 types of bone cells that we're going to need to know. And I'm actually going to drop down to the bottom 2 here to start this conversation. So first off, you've got what we call osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the bone builders. These are cells that basically construct new bone by depositing minerals. So depositing calcium, for example, to create new bone tissue. Osteoclasts are the bone breakers. These are really good for regenerating bone through bone remodeling. They help to absorb existing bone tissue where it's either not needed or it's degenerating or damaged. So it's really good at the remodeling process because it can break down existing but unnecessary or damaged bone tissue. Okay, so osteoblasts are the bone builders, osteoclasts are the bone breakers. And up top, calling the shots throughout our entire bone tissue, you've got these osteocytes. These are just the bone tissue managers, kind of. They basically are the ones that help maintain healthy bone tissue by instructing osteoblasts and osteoclasts, telling them where they need to go based on the existing needs of the bone tissue. These are housed in these little gaps called lacunae that are throughout your lamellae, right? So the lamellae we covered, those are like little columns, little cylinders that run along your bone's length. And then within those are these little pockets where you have osteocytes that can basically keep tabs on how well the bone tissue is doing. And if any needs arise, they can instruct the blasts and the clasts how to do their job and where to go. The process of bone formation, we call this ossification, okay? So this is going to be a key part in forming your skeleton as an embryo. This starts at about week 8 and goes throughout your lifetime. It's essential for bone growth from childhood up until early adulthood, where your body's actually growing in size. And then later in life, it's going to be constantly used for bone remodeling and bone repair. You have 2 types of ossification. You've got intramembranous, which only applies to your clavicle and your skull. This is your collarbone and your skull bones. This is basically where you have new bone coming from fibrous membranes. Okay, it's not as common as the second type, which is endochondral. And this is basically where we start with cartilage and we replace that cartilage with bone. Okay, so this applies to all other bones that aren't your clavicle and your skull. So we are going to want to note, though, that cartilage is going to remain ultimately in 2 places. You're always going to have what we call articular cartilage. This is where 2 bones meet at a joint, and instead of allowing those bones to rub together and cause friction, which would be rather uncomfortable, you have the articular cartilage that basically cushions the ends of those bones. And then you're also going to have cartilage at your epiphyseal plates. These are your growth plates, where new bone growth occurs while bones are getting longer as your body grows. Okay, so those are the 2 places we're going to maintain cartilage. Everywhere else, cartilage is going to turn into bone tissue. Bone remodeling. So your bone is constantly being remodeled based on the needs of your body, based on the requirements of your environments. So this is important because if we didn't have the ability to remodel our bone tissue, calcium in our bones would basically just crystallize and it would make our bones really, really brittle, and really brittle bones would be really easy to break. So we need this ongoing process of remodeling and turnover of our bone tissue cells so that we can basically continue to respond with new healthy bone tissue to new environmental circumstances. The process of this, you can follow along here at the bottom as we go through. we're always going to start with those osteocytes, those managers that are going to release chemical signals, and those are going to tell our bone breaker osteoclast to go to the site of damage, right? We have no interest in maintaining damaged bone tissue. We want to make sure that we break down what's there, get it out of the way so that we can lay the new healthy tissue where it needs to go. And so these osteoclasts right here are going to go to that site of damage. They will release enzymes that allow them to basically digest all the existing calcium and phosphorus, or the calcium phosphate that basically makes up the mineral components of bone. And this is going to put the calcium and phosphate back into your blood so we can reabsorb those mineral components and use them as we need to elsewhere in the body or elsewhere in the bone tissue. You do also have macrophages, which are going to promote bone tissue remodeling. Macrophages are really good for also helping to break down other components of bone tissue to get those out of the way. And then finally, you have your osteoblasts, which come in and build new bone before they ultimately have served their purpose and they undergo a process of cell death that we call apoptosis. So osteoblasts, they're very, very selfless. They come in, they do their job, they help new tissue form, and once they've done their job, they get out of the way by quite literally removing themselves from existence. So it's going to start at a resting stage, some sort of a damage occurs, we reabsorb the existing mineral components, we reverse any sort of innervation or nutrient delivery via the vascular tissue, and then we have formation of new bone and overall the mineralization, which is the hardening and thickening of that bone tissue. So that's bone remodeling, what process is involved there. Now, from time to time, one example of a homeostatic imbalance, or more so an override of homeostasis, is whenever we unfortunately have something in our environment that overloads our bone's ability to handle it. And whenever a bone is overloaded, this can result in a fracture, which is basically the breaking of a bone. You see the different types of bone fractures here. So you see what a normal bone looks like. And then I would take a moment just to sort of look at the different angles at which these bones might be fractured, because based on the way in which a bone is fractured and its maybe overall, end point, like where the bone ends up being after the fracture, all of these things will basically advise what names fractures are specifically given to classify those. It's not going to be any sort of thing that I'm going to test you on the different types, but it might be interesting to you to know. And then whenever it comes to the treatment of a fracture, there's two parts to the treatment of a fracture. You have reduction, which is basically realigning whatever broken bone ends have fractured, right? So we want to make sure that we put our bone back into alignment. And then we want to immobilize that area, meaning we want to remove any sort of weight or stress from that bone. So this is basically going to keep the bone stable while the healing process is able to occur. And what does repair look like? This is where we're going to finish our discussion here in the skeletal system. Bone repair is going to start with a hematoma. This is just basically a collection of blood outside of where it normally would be. So outside of the normal blood vessels, so those veins and arteries, we have basically severed those via the fracture, and so we're going to have blood accumulate due to blood clots. Okay, so it's a collection of blood that basically is outside of the blood vessels, clotting up in the area where the break happened. And then you're going to have what's called a fibrocartilaginous callus. Okay, so this forms and this spans the break and connects the broken ends of the two bones. So this is kind of like the initial accumulation of blood, and then on the outsides surrounding that broken tissue, probably once it's realigned, or if it happens to be like a very minor fracture and it's already in alignment, this is where you have this callus form around that, and this is going to basically reattach to a minor extent the two bony pieces that would normally have been together before the fracture. And then you've got this bony callus formation. Osteoblasts begin forming the spongy bone on the inside and help also to replace the cartilaginous callus. Remember, we're going to have that cartilage that's going to then become new bone tissue. So that ossification process is going to be endochondral by definition. And overall bone remodeling, where the osteocytes are continually basically directing new bone tissue and existing damaged tissue to be broken down. So we're building up the new with the osteoblasts and breaking down the degenerated or damaged with the osteoclasts to be repackaged and recycled elsewhere. So very important process of bone repair. And that is going to conclude our discussion of the skeletal system in terms of lecture. We're going to be having some discovery stations that complement this unit. We're going to have some lab stations that complement this unit. We're going to have body diagrams that we're able to work with as well in this unit. So the learning is in no way done with just this lecture. We are just beginning. So I will see you at the next concept and at our next stations activities.